Welcome to this presentation on brain mapping. My name is Dr. Alaric Arenender, and my wife and I work with the Brain Research Institute to bring you increasing knowledge about the human potential and its evolution through mental techniques, in particular Maharshi's technologies of consciousness. Here is a picture of a brain, and the lights you will be seeing represent a transfer of the EEG onto a person's brain image. So this is one way of looking at EEG and seeing all the pathways that activate and interact across the brain. And you can see it's quite beautiful. What we normally see with the EEG, or brain waves, the electroencephalogram, are the surface representations with linear lines and so forth. But this is what actually would look like in 3D, with different parts of the brain communicating with other parts. And of course only a part of it's being shown here, otherwise it would be a mass of color. But this shows how dynamic the brain is, and this is what we'll be studying in this short introduction to brain mapping. So brain mapping is an overview of the dynamics of brain and consciousness and the benefits of the Transcendental Meditation program and technique. So there are a number of levels of dynamics. We're going to go through them sequentially. At the top, we're going to understand a little bit about the dynamics of consciousness. Then we'll talk about the basic dynamics of brain in relationship to EEG. And then we're going to talk about brain wave dynamics and how we see them in the practice of TM. Then we're going to go to the dynamics of the alpha wave and why it's so important and central to our understanding of TM. And finally, take this all together and talk about the dynamics of evolution. So we can see that we have on the left-hand side attention, and our attention can either go outwards into greater levels of excitation towards objects, therefore object referral, or it could sink inward, settle inward in a direction towards the self in a more self-referral direction. But this is a metaphor for the bubble diagram, or the mind, in which we have surface levels above this dotted line, in which we appreciate everyday thoughts, an average. And if this line represents, on the thinking level, time, we can see that actually thoughts come up out of the level of the unified field or the self, bubble to the surface, and reach our conscious awareness. But in between each one of these thoughts, there is that moment in which the brain had access to the unboundedness, but awareness was not able to be with that. What we'd like to do is to lower this dotted line and to make this contact with the unboundedness of our own perfect self to be an all-time reality. And when we transcend, this is how we go about. We can think that there is this mantra bubbling up out of pure consciousness, the self or Atma, and then over time it sequentially becomes more refined because of the natural tendency of the mind to have greater intelligence, bliss, and other values that the mantra represents. And this is a direction of self-referral dynamics, which is the basis of transcending. And we'll be seeing this in our activity of the brain waves. So let's now talk about the brain. And we can meet the most important part of your brain, which is your CEO, which is the very front of the brain. This is the prefrontal cortex, right behind the forehead and above the eye. This is the prefrontal cortex. It involves the sense of self. It's responsible for coordinating your values and beliefs, your goals and motivation, your creativity, your decisions, your self-control and habits, and so forth. All of these things are involved in the dynamics of the prefrontal cortex, which takes about 25 years of initial biological development to try to reach its full extent of capabilities, but in most cases that never happens because of lack of proper experience and too much stress and so forth. But we can look at the EEG of both the front and the back, and we can think of the front, as we mentioned, the CEO, the prefrontal cortex, and the back as two major domains of the brain. This is more the sense of self, or self-referral. This is more the domain of objects in the world, or object referral. And these two interact with each other, the CEO and the world. This is like the puppeteer, and this is like the puppet. This is you, and this is the world. And for each one of these areas, we can pick up the surface recordings of the EEG as they go up and down and oscillate, which we'll talk about more. We could ask questions of the CEO and ask questions of the world. To do that, we can put electrodes on at least 4 parts of the brain, and these 4 pretty much cover the front, left and right, and the back, left and right. In other words, you and the world. The CEO and space and time. So between the left analytic and the right synthetic areas, we have with these 4 electrodes pretty much mapped out the whole brain. You can have more electrodes, but this is a very good introduction. And when we do look at that, you get raw EEG. And that raw EEG is very complicated, but with a computer you can divide it up or break it down into its component parts. And these components have different names, which we've seen before. There's very slow delta, and again, this graph is about 1 second across here. There's delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. We're focusing mainly on these 3, and if you want to, on these 4, but primarily alpha, beta, and gamma, where they get between 10 cycles per second to about 20 to about 40 and higher. So these is the range of EEG, and when we start meditation, this is what we find. We find that if we have an electrode on the front of the brain or on the back of the brain, that there's increased orderliness during the practice of TM. In fact, within a few moments, the waking state object referral activity changes dramatically into the self-referral activity. We see this very complex, low amplitude activity to very simple, high amplitude activity, which represents tremendous degree of orderliness in the front and in the back, and between the front and the back. You can see that they look very similar, which would indicate that the front and the back are highly coordinated and correlated. In other words, coherent. Now, how did this happen? Well, there is something what we can talk about as local coherence, how different cells, and here's a part of the brain in the cortex, and there are cells in it, and these cells have activity, and that activity gives rise to the EEG on the surface. So we're going to look at this area of the brain before and then after we start the TM technique. And of course, this is the EEG, and this is the cerebral cortex. And you can see that that the activity of the brain is going to oscillate. There's electrical oscillations in the brain, and these oscillations give rise to the surface activity. But because there's so many diverse types of dynamics or looping, we find a great complexity of the looping here. A lot of fast activity, a lot of slow activity, and middle activity. But when we begin the TM technique, what happens is all these cells which are doing something different nearby start doing almost the exact same thing, and therefore not only does the EEG become simpler in terms of its frequency composition, but the energy gets higher and higher and higher. So you can see the major difference when we start TM, because these cells are now locally more coherent or correlated. This is called power. Local coherence is actually power. Well, most people speak of it as alpha power, but it's really what we refer to as local coherence, because these cells start becoming more coherent when we begin TM in each area of the brain. So alpha waves, since we're talking about alpha waves, they are generically between 8 and 12 times in a second. They oscillate. You can see the oscillation over 1 second here. And they're the dominant oscillation in the brain. Almost all the energy in the brain is at this alpha activity, which indicates again that it must be very important. And it is, because it's shown to coordinate the dynamism of almost all the brain. It's useful in integrating information. It's an intentional filter, and it's related to alertness and a sense of self as well. These depend upon where you find it in the brain and what particular frequency, but this shows that the alpha waves are very, very important. Each frequency band, alpha, beta, gamma, and so forth, each one has its own significance, but you'll see that the alpha is highly significant, as we just outlined here in brief. So, if we look at cortical alpha coherence, in other words, how brain cells work at an alpha frequency together, we can find that there's local, global, and in total brain functioning. We talked previously about local coherence, where is when you have a particular assembly of cells, there's correlation of their firing. In other words, the activity in a local assembly, they fire together, and therefore you get a much more correlated activity, and therefore local coherence, or as is normally known as power. So this local coherence is the same as power, EEG power. Now, if you look at different assemblies that are at a distance to each other, that are connected with wires, that we find global coherence. In other words, a correlation between two different parts of the brain, as opposed to a correlation within a local small assembly of the cells, giving rise to increased power or local coherence. So there's local and global, within a region and between regions. And then if we find that there's correlation amongst all the assemblies, or nearly all the assemblies, we could call that total coherence or total brain functioning. So we have three levels of alpha coherence we can talk about: local assemblies, between distant assemblies, and between all the assemblies, amongst all the assemblies. So coherence is a measure of correlation in a frequency domain over a certain period of time. We're going to see that and how that works. But in particular, we can summarize the research on TM in alpha brain state, that during either transcendental consciousness or the state of cosmic consciousness, transcendental consciousness is defined as, in part, slow alpha coherence during the meditation. Slow alpha means between usually 8 or 9, 10 cycles per second, as opposed to the higher 10, 11, 12. So slow alpha coherence, or alpha 1 or low alpha, that represents in many regards transcendental consciousness. There are more definitive definitions, but this is the relationship to alpha. And published research over 10 years ago now shows that cosmic consciousness is when slow alpha coherence is seen during the waking state. So we have transcendental consciousness and cosmic consciousness, and how alpha waves and their coherences contribute to our understanding of different states of consciousness and the brain dynamics supporting them. So if we looked at more than just 4 electrodes, we would see the same thing. And that is that on the left we see a person with their eyes open in activity, and we see different sensors we could have. We could have 20 or 30 or 200 sensors on the head, and there's a relationship between them shown by the red lines. So the lines indicate the degree of coherence. The thicker and more dominant the red line means higher the coherence. So at this particular moment, let's say for 2.5 seconds, there's a huge amount of coherence in these particular electrodes, some here but less here, and so forth. So there's a very great diversity and variegated nature of coherence in the brain at any one time. But when a person starts meditating, look what happens to the brain. The whole thing falls into a very high coherent activity across all the activity of the brain. So this is, again, unique to the TM technique, and in particular with the alpha coherence. Now next is a graphic showing what happens over time. So we can start this. And this is about every 2.5 seconds, or 5 seconds, doesn't make a difference. This is normal. You can see that every couple seconds there's a change in configuration in the brain because we're computing different thoughts and different activity. But a coherent brain in waking state uses more correlation, more coherence among all the different areas to create a much more powerful cognitive and therefore feeling and emotional and behavioral basis. So this is how TM works to create more and more coherence. Now, let's look at coherence in a graph. We have here an EEG. This is the prefrontal cortex of a non-meditator, and you can see on just one side, say left side, and it goes up and down and so forth. And here is the coherence of the same non-meditator over the same time frame of about 30 seconds. And you can see on this bottom is a graph. Across 30 seconds, there is a graph from minimum to maximum coherence, or orderliness, or correlation. Minimum to maximum, 0 or 100% if you want. Actually, the scale is 0 to 1, but we can think of 0 to 100%. And you can see that for this individual, there's an oscillation. This oscillation is normal. There's more coherence and then less, and there's more and then less, and then more and then less, and then more and less. That's natural consideration because we feel that this is a relationship between a change in the brain and then locking into a particular pattern of activity, and then a change and a locking and a change, a locking and a shift and a locking. As we shift along in our cognitive world of increasing activity during the day, we see that there's always these moments of locking and then shifting. And this is normal, but we see here for the non-meditator, the average is anywhere between 25, it could be up even to 40 or 50. But the idea here is that for the non-meditator, the coherence, normal coherence with eyes closed, is relatively low. Here's an example of an individual sitting meditating, and again there's only 4 electrodes, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. And you can see that here's the left front and the right front. This is EEG. At the arrow they started meditating, and you can see right at that arrow that these 4 lines all track upwards into high levels of coherence, remember 0 to 100%. track up to this very high level and remain up there. And these 4 lines are the 4 coherences we're measuring here, which is the relation between the 2 front, the 2 back, the left side, and the right side. Remember, in our graph before, we had 4 electrodes, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. So we have an ability to measure between the 2 front coherence, between the 2 back coherence, between the front and back on the left side, and the front and back on the right side. And you can see that's exactly what happens. There's a normal fluctuation, although it's higher than most people in society, because he's a meditator. And this normal fluctuation occurs, and then they start meditating. And the normal fluctuation a bit subsides, and now we find just this very high level of dominant coherence across the entire brain in this alpha frequency. And we can show you another closer picture now. Again, there's this obviously locking and then shifting, and then locking and shifting, and then locking and then shifting, and then locking and shifting. And then we lock in on this very deep level of mentation and meditation with the mantra and this experience of transcendence. Here's another example. If we just look at a single electrode, you see the 2 left and right front, and here's the power spectrum, which is about 8 hertz. So this is eyeball in the back. And this is 8 hertz over time. So as time goes forward into the future, we see the 8 hertz continues on both sides, left and right. And this is exemplified by the coherence beforehand going shifting, locking, and then shifting and locking into this experience of transcendence and deep meditation in the prefrontal cortex with alpha. So coherence unifies brain activity. Coherence represents connectedness. It helps create connectedness in the brain. And everything good about the brain, mind, and behavior depends upon the degree of coherence. We want highly orderly connectivity among all the different components of the hugely diverse human brain. And when we look at the results over the last 60, 70 years of research on the TM program, we find that the EEG coherence is correlated with all the beautiful phenomena found in meditating individuals. Here's an example. With EEG coherence, if it goes higher, there's a correlation with higher coherence with all these different aspects which are measured at the same time in the same people. That is, when there's higher coherence, there's more creativity. When there's higher coherence, there's more self-centeredness, more self-confidence, and so forth. When we have higher coherence, in particular in the prefrontal cortex, and this is primarily alpha activity, there's a correlation with enlightenment, cosmic consciousness, less stress and anxiety, better ability to learn, more self-awareness, the body works better, neuromuscular efficiency, we're able to compute better, our raw intelligence increases, we're not so crazy, there's more emotional stability, we're able to have big concepts while keeping track of the small details, and we become more moral spontaneously. So here are some, but not all, the correlations that we can find that when the brain is more coherent, very good things happen on the level of mind, body, and behavior. So Transcendental Meditation increases spontaneously this self-referral experience in an effortless way. It leads to dramatic state of brain order, which then in turn leads to remarkable states of physiological order and longevity. So with that, we can then end by saying that we are now going to look at your EEG and analyze that. So thank you very much for this short introduction.